In order to understand how literature was influenced by the Renaissance, we need to look into the word Renaissance itself. The word Renaissance translates into the word rebirth, and this is because the Renaissance was an era of explosion and creativity, not just literature-wise, but scientific, religion, political, and art-wise. Many of the ideas and events that were spread in that time period are still vital and essential to our world today. The Renaissance erupted from the Middle Ages and began with the collapse of the Roman Empire. It all started in Florence, Italy, in the 14th century and had spread all the way to England by the 17th century, which was the century the Renaissance had ended. The main reason why Europe's culture exploded in the Renaissance was because of one man, Johannes Gutenberg. He invented the printing press in 1450, and what he did was so significant because literature prior to this invention were either to be passed down orally from generation to generation by people memorizing stories, or writers were left to other methods like woodblock printing, movable type, and even handwriting. And so publishing books was a long process. Sometimes it took up to more than a year. It was rare to find someone that read, and if they could, they were considered to be highly skilled. And this was mainly because books were expensive, and they were only being written in Latin. But that changed through the printing press. The first authors to write in different languages were Dante, who wrote in Italian, and Chaucer, who wrote in English. Another piece of great literature was the Bible, which was translated into the vernacular by Thomas Linacre, John Colet, Martin Luther, and many other scholars. Another benefit of the printing press was that it made books much cheaper because they were easier to produce. And so since more people had their hands on books, ideas and theories spread like wildfire in the areas of Italy and England. With literature regarding religion, literature took on a huge impactful role. Without literature, the Protestant Reformation would not have existed. A man named Martin Luther ignited the Protestant Reformation by opposing the Catholic Church because of its corruption and leading role in the state. The church's abuse and corruption included the church collecting money for indulgences, which are grants made by the Pope for the remission of the sins people have committed. He also disagreed with the ruling of the divine right, which is a doctrine of royal and political legitimacy and asserts that a monarch has the right to rule from the will of God, which basically implies that the king has no limits, and that the church has something to do with that because it is them that grants the king its legitimacy. Then finally in 1517, Martin Luther created what is considered to be the literary culture of the Protestant Reformation, which is the document called 95 Theses. This document is entitled to a list of questions and proposals for the Catholic Church. He hung this document in front of the Wittenberg church door, and when people saw this, they did not take this lightly, and they themselves started quickly ask themselves the same thing Luther asked himself about the church, and so many people began to rally against the Catholic Church, which is what starts the Protestant Reformation. The idea behind the 95 Theses is that salvation could only be achieved through good works and acts of kindness, not for money, and that people are not to be ruled from man but from God. Politically, the Renaissance still poses as a huge impact to this day. Like, for example, in the present day, the Pope and the Church have no power at all with this state and its functions. But during the Renaissance, it was the complete opposite, and the Church actually chose who has the right to the throne, and the Pope actually has a say in the king's decisions. However, all these things changed because of Niccolo Machiavelli. When Machiavelli wrote his most famous work, The Prince, in 1513, it was so powerful it changed the course of history. His book opposed the Catholic Church and argued that it should not have anything to do with the state, and that they are two separate things, which is why we have our government the way it is working today. This truly exemplifies how powerful literature can be. Another heated topic in his book that we can still debate today is whether a leader is better to be loved or feared. And though both sides may have good arguments, we may never know the true answer because such a leader that was perfect or loved by everybody has never came into existence.
The awakening of the Renaissance in literature was greatly found in vernacular literature made at the time. They formed their own opinions through this literature and began to create their own great writings. These pieces of literature then became works of art throughout the era, works of art like Cid, King Arthur and the Holy Grail, and Canterbury Tales. The most important part of literature in the Renaissance was the poetry and the poets who wrote it, including authors such as Christopher Marlowe, Robert Herrick, and of course William Shakespeare. Shakespeare brought a new sense of realism to the theater with his extremely creative dramas, characters, as well as showing diversity in all of his playwrights. No one really knows about his opinions on life because he wrote such diverse plays. He wrote things from love to tragedy, all giving extremely strong effects on his audience. Shakespeare expressed great individualism in all of his stories. Each story had characters that were all different, but still managed to have so many distinct characteristics. In almost all of his stories, his characters all seemed to believe in some kind of religion, but never express it strongly during the story. It is as if it is automatic that they believe in God. They don't strongly express it because the decisions his characters make are for their own sake and not God's. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, the couple deliberately go against their family's word and love each other, not caring about anyone but themselves and one another. When they commit suicide, it is not a sacrifice for anyone but for themselves. But that was not always the case. In Hamlet, Claudius is sad awaiting his punishment after death. So in some rare cases, Shakespeare was not always consistent with the same plot. But Shakespeare did have very similar setups and similar characters. However, he made it seem like they were different. Shakespeare's work was of genius. He was able to write extremely long sonnets that not many writers could write. Shakespeare was born a wonderful writer and was able to attain this capability. His skills in literature is why we still study him today.